That'll teach him to ignore a $2,000 fine for an unapproved mailbox, she sneered, her voice dripping with the kind of smug satisfaction only a true tyrant can muster. I watched from the tree line as Brenda, our HOA president from hell, gestured proudly at the splintered wood and broken glass that used to be my family's lake cabin. The demolition crew was just packing up, the scent of fresh-cut pine and devastation hanging heavy in the air. This was her victory lap. But her smile faltered as I stepped out from the shadows, not with tears, but with a cold calm that seemed to unnerve her. "You have no idea what you've just done," I said, my voice level. She scoffed, but I just held up my wallet, flipping it open. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face as she saw the gold shield and the words engraved beneath it, Federal Environmental Crimes Investigator. The sneer froze, replaced by a dawning, gut-wrenching horror. The mailbox was never the point, this was. My little takedown was about to go from personal to biblical. This story gets absolutely crazy, so stick with me. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because you won't believe how this ends. The cabin wasn't just a structure, it was a repository of memories, a place woven into the fabric of my family's history for 3 generations. My grandfather, a civil engineer who believed in building things that lasted, laid the foundation himself back in the 50s. He'd bought the parcel of land on the shores of Whisperwood Lake for a song, long before the area became a desirable summer destination, and long before anyone had ever heard of a homeowners association. He and my grandmother built it log by log, their sweat and laughter soaked into the very timbers. He designed it with a pragmatism and elegance that reflected his profession. The joists were over-specced, the stone fireplace was a masterpiece of thermodynamics that could heat the entire place on the coldest winter night, and the wide porch faced perfectly west to catch the sunset over the water. It was where my father learned to fish, where I took my first steps, and where I'd planned to one day teach my own kids about the constellations, far from the city's light pollution. After my grandfather passed, he left it to me in his will, not just as property, but as a trust. "Look after the old place, son," he told me, his voice thin but firm. "It's looked after us." It was a sanctuary, a rugged, authentic piece of our family standing against the tide of prefabricated, soulless vacation homes that had started to sprout up around the lake. These new homes, with their identical beige siding and manicured, chemically treated lawns, were the domain of the Whisperwood Lake HOA. Our cabin, a grandfathered property, had always been technically exempt from their rules, a fact documented in the original county deeds. For years, this was a non-issue. The HOA was a sleepy, mostly administrative body that handled road maintenance and the community boat ramp. Then, 3 years ago, Brenda Vickers was elected president. Brenda was the human embodiment of a cease and desist letter. She was a woman in her late 50s who wore her expensive, jewel-toned pantsuits like armor. Her face was a permanent mask of disapproval, her lips pursed so tightly they seemed to be holding back a torrent of violations and fines. She drove a pristine white Lexus SUV, which she parked at angles that seemed deliberately inconsiderate, and her voice carried a grating, nasal authority that could curdle milk. She and her husband, a silent, perpetually bewildered-looking man named Gary, had bought the largest of the new builds, a monstrous, vaguely Tuscan-style McMansion that loomed over the lakefront. From the moment she took power, the HOA transformed. It was no longer a community cooperative. It was her personal fiefdom. The monthly newsletter, once a single page of announcements, swelled into a glossy, multi-page booklet, filled with new, increasingly bizarre regulations. The color of one's outdoor umbrella was now subject to approval. Holiday decorations had to be removed within 48 hours of the holiday's conclusion. All mailboxes had to conform to a single, pre-approved, and ridiculously expensive model, sold by a company that, I later discovered, was owned by her brother-in-law. It was suburban warfare, waged with bylaws and violation notices. Because my cabin was exempt, I managed to stay off her radar for the first couple of years. I paid my dues for road maintenance and was content to be left alone. I was an observer, watching from my rustic porch as my neighbors were forced to rip out beautiful, native plant gardens because they didn't fit the approved aesthetic, or were fined for leaving their trash cans visible from the road for more than 3 hours on collection day. It was absurd, but I had my own battles to fight. My work as a federal investigator for the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division often took me away for weeks, sometimes months at a time. I dealt with real criminals, corporations dumping toxic waste into rivers, international smuggling rings trafficking in endangered species, and contractors knowingly exposing their workers to asbestos. My world was one of forensic accounting, stakeouts, and building complex legal cases that took years to come to fruition. Dealing with a petty tyrant like Brenda seemed beneath my notice, a silly little drama I could safely ignore. That was my mistake. Underestimating a zealot is always a mistake. The catalyst for my downfall, and ultimately hers, was a simple, handcrafted mailbox. My grandfather had built it from a hollowed-out log with a small, hand-forged metal flag shaped like a trout. It was charming, unique, and had stood at the end of our dirt driveway for over 60 years. It was as much a part of the property as the cabin itself. One Friday afternoon, I arrived at the lake after a grueling 3-month investigation in Louisiana, dreaming of nothing more than a quiet weekend of fishing and disconnecting. Taped to my cabin door was a bright pink slip of paper. It was a formal violation notice from the Whisperwood Lake HOA. The offense: installation of a non-compliant mail receptacle. A fine of $100 was assessed, with a warning that the fine would double every 30 days it went unpaid. I chuckled, crumpled it up, and tossed it into the fire pit. It was a clerical error, a simple misunderstanding. They couldn't fine me for a pre-existing grandfathered structure. My property wasn't subject to their aesthetic edicts. I decided I'd clear it up with a simple phone call on Monday. That weekend was idyllic. I caught a beautiful rainbow trout, read a book on the porch, and felt the tension of my job melt away with each ripple on the lake. On Monday morning, I called the HOA's contact number. Brenda herself answered, her voice immediately hostile. Whisperwood Lake Association, Brenda Vickers speaking. How may I direct your violation? I explained, calmly and politely, that my property was exempt from the HOA's covenants regarding aesthetic rules, as detailed in the original property deeds filed with the county. I even offered to send her a copy of the relevant section. Her response was a dismissive sniff. Mr. Peterson, that's a common misconception. When the new community guidelines were ratified in 2022, all properties within the designated Whisperwood Lake Zone became subject to the full bylaws. Your grandfather clause, as you call it, is no longer valid. This was patently untrue. HOA bylaws cannot unilaterally supersede deeded property rights and county records. I tried to explain this legal reality to her. Brenda, I said, trying to maintain a patient tone, that's not how property law works. An HOA can't just dissolve a recorded deed restriction. Your lawyer could confirm that for you in about 5 minutes. A cold silence met me on the other end of the line. Are you a lawyer, Mr. Peterson? She asked, her voice dangerously sweet. No, I admitted. But I have a fairly good understanding of how. Then I suggest you leave the legal interpretations to the professionals, she snapped. The fine stands. You have 27 days to pay the $100 and replace the offending object with the approved model, part number 7B, from the approved catalog. Good day. The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, stunned by her audacity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a power play. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was testing me, seeing if I would roll over like everyone else. For a moment, I considered just paying the ridiculous fine. It was only $100. But then I looked at that mailbox, the trout my grandfather had so carefully crafted, and a cold, hard stubbornness settled in my gut. It was my property. It was my history. And no jumped-up little dictator in a pantsuit was going to force me to tear down a piece of it. That $100 fine was the first shot fired in a war I didn't want, but one I was now absolutely determined to win. The $100 fine was an annoyance, a gnat to be swatted away. The problem was, this net had the backing of a quasi-governmental body and was piloted by a woman with an ego the size of her oversized SUV. My first move was one of de-escalation. I believed, perhaps naively, that reason could prevail. I drafted a polite but firm letter, a document that would become Exhibit A in my burgeoning mental file against Brenda Vickers. In it, I laid out the facts clearly and without emotion. I cited the specific paragraph and page number from my property deed, which explicitly exempted my lot from any subsequent covenants related to aesthetic modifications. I attached a notarized copy of the deed itself, along with a relevant page from the county plat map showing my property lines were established decades before the HOA's existence. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested. This was standard procedure in my professional life. Create an unassailable paper trail. 2 weeks passed, with no response. The 30-day deadline for the fine approached. I then received a second notice in the mail. It was another pink slip, this time for $200, the original fine having doubled. Attached was a terse, one-sentence note, personally signed by Brenda. Receipt of your correspondence is acknowledged. The board has reviewed your claim and found it to be without merit. The fine stands. The sheer arrogance was breathtaking. Reviewed your claim was code for, I glanced at it and threw it in the trash. I knew then that direct communication was a dead end. Brenda wasn't interested in facts or law. She was interested in compliance. My next step was to engage with the system she controlled. The HOA held monthly meetings in the sterile beige clubhouse that overlooked the community pool. I'd never attended one before, seeing them as a breeding ground for the kind of petty squabbles I actively avoided. But now, I had a purpose. I marked the date on my calendar. The meeting was on a Tuesday evening. I walked in and the atmosphere was thick with a kind of suburban tension. About 20 residents were scattered amongst the folding chairs, their faces a mixture of resentment and resignation. At the front of the room, behind a long folding table, sat the HOA board. There was Brenda, center stage, looking imperious in a royal blue pantsuit. To her right sat a mousy woman named Carol, the secretary, who furiously scribbled notes and refused to make eye contact with anyone. To her left was a man named Dennis, the treasurer, who had the look of someone who had long ago surrendered his will to a stronger personality. These were her enablers. They were the ones who rubber-stamped her every decree. I took a seat and waited for the open forum portion of the meeting. When my turn came, I stood up and introduced myself. Good evening. My name is Mark Peterson. I own the cabin at 112 Willow Point. A few heads nodded in recognition. My family had been there longer than most. I calmly and methodically presented my case to the entire room. I spoke not of emotion or family history, but of legal documents and county records. I explained the concept of a grandfathered property right, how it was a cornerstone of property law, designed to protect owners from exactly this kind of retroactive overreach. I held up my copy of the deed. This isn't an opinion, I stated, making eye contact with Dennis and Carol. This is a legally binding document, recorded with the county. The association's own governing documents state they must operate within the bounds of state and county law. By attempting to enforce this fine, the board is acting outside its legal authority. I could see flickers of interest and support on the faces of some of my neighbors. One gentleman in the back, a retired plumber named George who'd been fined for having the wrong brand of hose reel, gave me a subtle thumbs up. I had them. For a moment, I thought I had broken through the wall of apathy. Then Brenda spoke. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Peterson, she said, her voice syrupy with condescension. She didn't look at my documents. She didn't address a single legal point I made. Instead, she turned to the audience. What Mr. Peterson is advocating for, she began, framing it as a threat to them all, is the right for one person to ignore the rules that the rest of us have all agreed to live by. He believes he is special. He believes his property shouldn't have to conform to the community standards that protect all of our property values. It was a masterful, toxic pivot. She was turning me from a property owner defending his rights into an elitist who thought he was better than everyone else. We are a community of rules. she continued, her voice rising with rehearsed passion. Rules that ensure our neighborhood remains beautiful and desirable. If we allow one person to have a rusty, hand-carved mailbox, what's next? Cars on lawns? Unpainted houses? Where does it end? The board has reviewed this matter and our position is final. She slammed her gavel down. Next item. I was dismissed. Just like that. The support I had glimpsed on my neighbors' faces evaporated, replaced by the familiar look of cowed submission. They might agree with me, but they weren't willing to become Brenda's next target. I left the meeting seething. My methodical, rational approach had failed spectacularly. Brenda didn't care about the law. She cared about power, and she had just demonstrated that she held it all. The battle lines were no longer blurry. This was not a dispute to be negotiated. It was an infection to be excised. As I walked to my car, George, the retired plumber, caught up with me. He was an older man, with kind eyes and work-worn hands. "Hey," he said, looking over his shoulder as if to make sure Brenda's spies weren't listening. "Don't let her get to you. She's a real piece of work. Did the same thing to me over a hose reel. Cost me $50. It's not about the money anymore," I said, the frustration evident in my voice. "She's just making it up as she goes along." "You're telling me," he scoffed. "She runs that board like the Gestapo. Dennis and Carol just do whatever she says. They're terrified of her. You know, her husband, Gary, used to be on the board. He tried to argue with her once, in a public meeting, about a new rule on lawn ornaments. She shut him down so hard, right in front of everyone. He resigned the next day, hasn't spoken a word at a meeting since." George's information was a small but crucial piece of the puzzle. It confirmed my assessment. Brenda's power was absolute. Her board was a collection of hostages, and any direct challenge through her own system was doomed to fail. "Be careful, son," George warned. "She holds a grudge. She'll find a way to get you." His words were an unintentional echo of my own thoughts. I knew he was right. The fine, now ballooned to $400, was just the beginning. She had been publicly challenged, and a person like Brenda could not let that stand. I drove away from the clubhouse that night with a cold certainty. The time for letters and public appeals was over. She wanted to play by a different set of rules. Fine. I had spent my entire career dismantling organizations far more sophisticated and dangerous than her little HOA. It was time to stop being Mark Peterson, quiet cabin owner, and start thinking like Investigator Peterson of the EPA. It was time to do some research. The drive back to my city apartment was a 2-hour crucible of controlled fury. The condescending smirk on Brenda's face was seared into my memory. Her gavel strike wasn't just the end of a meeting item. It was a declaration of war. By the time I walked through my own front door, the anger had cooled and crystallized into something far more dangerous. A plan. My day job involves unraveling complex webs of deceit. I follow money. I parse labyrinthine regulations. And I identify the weak points in corrupt structures until the whole rotten edifice comes crashing down. Brenda Vickers thought she was running a simple HOA. I was about to treat her little kingdom as a federal racketeering case. My first move was to pivot from defending myself to investigating her. The mailbox was a symptom. The disease was the HOA's leadership. I logged into my professional-grade research databases, tools the average citizen doesn't even know exist. I started with Brenda and her husband, Gary. Simple public record searches yielded the basics: their address, the purchase price of their McMansion, their political contributions, all to a specific county commissioner, which I noted, and their business filings. The first interesting morsel appeared. Brenda was listed as the sole proprietor of a consulting company, Vickers Community Solutions, LLC. Its registered address was her home. The business description was vague, providing management and aesthetic consulting for planned communities. It was a shell, but for what? Then I cross-referenced the HOA's public filings. I found their annual budgets, meeting minutes, which were suspiciously sparse and boilerplate, and a list of their approved vendors. And there it was. The landscaping company that held the exclusive lucrative contract for all common areas, Lush Green Landscapes, was also registered to an address in a neighboring town. A quick dive into that state's corporate registry revealed the owner, Stephen Miller, and a search of Stephen Miller's known associates and family members brought up his sister's married name, Brenda Vickers. She had steered a no-bid, exclusive contract to her own brother's company. It was a classic, flagrant conflict of interest, and almost certainly a violation of the HOA's own bylaws regarding fiduciary duty. This was the first brick. Now I needed a wall. I turned my attention to the mailbox company, the one with the approved Model 7B. The company, Prestige Postboxes, was based out of state. But its listed agent, the legal contact for the business, was a man named David Vickers, Gary's brother. Brenda wasn't just wielding power for the sake of it. She was systematically monetizing it, turning her neighbor's compliance into a revenue stream for her extended family. She wasn't a president, she was a mob boss. This was RICO-level stuff, on a comically small suburban scale. My anger was now laced with a grim professional satisfaction. This was familiar territory. The next phase required boots on the ground. I took 2 days of personal leave and drove back up to the lake, but not to my cabin. I booked a room at a small motel in the next town over. I became a ghost. I spent hours at the county records office, not just looking at my own deed, but pulling the plat maps and incorporation documents for the entire Whisperwood Lake development. I found what I was hoping for. The original developer, a company that went bankrupt in the late 90s, had designated several parcels as community green space, or riparian buffer zones. These were areas that were never to be developed, meant to preserve the natural shoreline and provide drainage. I overlaid these old maps with current satellite imagery and the HOA's own internal maps. The results were startling. The location of the new, expensive community gazebo? It was built directly on top of a designated riparian buffer zone, the perfectly manicured lawn stretching from Brenda's property down to the water, giving her an uninterrupted lake view. It covered a parcel that was clearly marked as community green space. She hadn't just bent the rules, she had literally bulldozed over them for her own benefit, illegally appropriating common land for her personal use. I photographed every document, every map, every page. My evidence folder was growing thick. My final investigatory thrust was the most delicate. I needed to speak to the residents again, but not in a public forum where Brenda could control the narrative. I needed to talk to them one-on-one. I remembered George, the retired plumber. He was my way in. I found him tinkering with his sprinkler system on a Thursday morning. "George," I said quietly, approaching him not as a frustrated neighbor but as a man with a purpose. "I'm building a case against Brenda and the board. A real one. And I need your help." I showed him a few of my findings: the conflict of interest with the landscaping company, the illegal construction on the buffer zone. I didn't show him everything, just enough to let him know I was serious. His kind eyes hardened. "I knew it," he hissed. "I knew she was crooked. That landscaping bill goes up 20% every year, like clockwork. Dennis just approves it. What do you need?" He became my silent partner, my confidential informant. He knew everyone. He knew who had been fined unjustly, who had been bullied into submission, and who was just waiting for a chance to fight back. Over the next 2 days, guided by George, I conducted a series of quiet interviews. I spoke to a young mother fined for having a playset made of unapproved cedar wood. I talked to an elderly widow who was threatened with a lien on her house for planting azaleas that were the wrong shade of pink. With each conversation, a pattern of abuse, intimidation, and financial exploitation emerged. I collected copies of their violation notices, their canceled checks for unjust fines. Many were too afraid to go on the record, but some, emboldened by the evidence I'd compiled, agreed to provide sworn affidavits if it came to it. The smoking gun came from the most unlikely of sources: Carol, the mousy board secretary. George told me she was a recent widow and was terrified of losing her home. He suspected she was in over her head. I approached her not with aggression, but with empathy. I met her at a coffee shop far from the lake. I told her I knew she was in a difficult position. I laid out the evidence of Brenda's self-dealing, framing it not as an accusation against Carol, but as a potential legal liability she was now exposed to. I explained the concept of joint and several liability for board members. Brenda is steering contracts to her family, Carol, I said gently. If this comes out, and it will, anyone who signed off on those payments could be held legally and financially responsible. You didn't know, and that's your defense. But you have to do the right thing now. Her face crumpled. Through tears, she confessed. Brenda controlled everything. She pre-wrote the meeting minutes, and Carol was just told to sign them. The board never actually voted on the vendor contracts. Brenda just presented them as renewals and had them pushed through. Then she gave me the jackpot. Every month, Brenda would submit a bundle of receipts for reimbursement from the HOA treasury. Things like office supplies, mileage, and consulting fees. Carol, as the secretary, kept copies. She had a box of them in her garage. She thought they seemed high, but she was too scared to question them. I went with her back to her house. She handed me the box. It was a treasure trove of petty larceny. Receipts from high-end restaurants classified as board meetings, gas receipts for her Lexus that far exceeded any plausible HOA travel, and most damningly, monthly invoices for thousands of dollars from Vickers Community Solutions, LLC, for management services. She was paying herself a salary from the HOA coffers on top of all the kickbacks. It was embezzlement, plain and simple. I had it all. Conflicts of interest, illegal construction, misappropriation of community land, systematic extortion through fines, and now, irrefutable evidence of embezzlement. The mailbox fine had now escalated from $400 to $800, then to $1,600. I had ignored every subsequent notice. I knew Brenda's fury would be growing. She was a predator, and I was wounded prey that refused to die. Her next move would be reckless, and I was going to be ready for it. My quiet weekend cabin had become the unlikely beachhead for a full-scale assault on a suburban tyrant. I had the evidence, the witnesses, and the legal firepower. All I needed now was for her to make one last, fatal mistake. And I knew, with the certainty of a seasoned investigator, that she wouldn't be able to resist. My silence was a calculated strategy, a quiet line cast into the murky waters of Brenda's ego. I knew she couldn't stand being ignored. Each returned certified letter, each unpaid fine doubling into absurdity now, standing at a theoretical $200, was a direct affront to her authority. I was a loose thread on the perfect tapestry of her community, and she had to pull it, no matter the cost. My ally George kept me updated. The whispers at the community mail kiosk were that the guy in the log cabin was openly defying President Vickers. According to George, Brenda was becoming increasingly unhinged during board meetings, ranting about disrespect and the need to make an example of me. She was losing her carefully curated composure, and a desperate tyrant is a predictable one. I anticipated her next move would be a lien against my property. It was the standard HOA nuclear option. I was prepared for it. I had already retained a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense guy who specialized in property law, and was chomping at the bit when I laid out my file of evidence. We were ready to countersue the HOA into oblivion, not just to remove the lien, but to seek damages for harassment, breach of fiduciary duty, and a dozen other things. A lien was the move of a bureaucrat. But Brenda was no mere bureauist. She was a narcissist, scorned. She wanted not just compliance, she wanted humiliation. A lien was too clean, too legalistic. She wanted something more visceral. The warning came on a Wednesday morning. My work had sent me to a conference in Seattle for the week. George called me, his voice fraught with urgency. "Mark, you need to get back here. Now. A demolition crew just showed up at your place." My blood ran cold. "What? They can't do that. They don't have a court order." "I don't think she cares about a court order," George said grimly. "There's a big excavator and a couple of guys in hard hats. Brenda's there with them, holding a piece of paper and pointing at your cabin. I tried to talk to them, and she threatened to have me fined for interfering with HOA business." This was it, the fatal mistake. It was more brazen, more insane than I could have ever predicted. She wasn't just breaking bylaws, She was leveling a man's home. I thanked George and told him to stay away and not get involved. Then I made 2 calls. The first was to my lawyer. "She's doing it," I said, my voice eerily calm. "She's demolishing the cabin. Get the emergency injunction filed, but they'll be done before it's served. It doesn't matter. Now we have her. This is felony destruction of property. Call the county sheriff. Tell them an illegal demolition is in progress. Give them the address." My second call was to my boss, the regional director for the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division. "John," I said, "I need to take the rest of the week off for a personal emergency. It's a bit of a sensitive situation, but it's about to be resolved. And I may need to use my professional credentials in an official capacity to stop a crime in progress." John, a man I'd been to hell and back with, didn't ask many questions. "Do what you have to do, Mark. Just make sure the paperwork is clean." I booked the first flight back. The entire 4-hour flight was a surreal experience. I wasn't angry anymore. The emotion had been burned out of me, replaced by an ice-cold clarity. I was an investigator arriving at a crime scene I owned. I landed, rented a car, and drove straight for the lake, not even stopping at my apartment. As I turned down the long dirt road leading to my property, my heart hammered against my ribs, the only outward sign of the turmoil within. I parked my car 100 yards away and walked the rest of the way, using the dense woods as cover. And then I saw it. Or rather, I saw what was left. My grandfather's cabin, the place of my childhood, was a heap of splintered logs, shattered windows, and pathetic debris. The great stone fireplace, a testament to his engineering skill, was the only thing left standing, a lonely monument in a field of ruin. The excavator sat idle, its work done, and there was Brenda. She was standing with the demolition foreman, a checkbook in her hand. She was beaming, flushed with victory. She had done it. She had erased the blight, the one symbol of defiance in her perfect little kingdom. That's when she delivered the line I would cherish forever. The words she spat out with such smug finality. "That'll teach him to ignore a $2,000 fine for an unapproved mailbox." The foreman, a grizzled man who looked deeply uncomfortable, just shrugged and took the check. This was my cue. I stepped out of the woods. My approach was quiet, measured. Every step was deliberate. Brenda's eyes snapped towards me. The triumphant smirk faltered for just a second, surprised to see me there. But it quickly returned, even more condescending than before. "Well, well, Mr. Peterson. Decided to finally show up? A little late, I'm afraid. We've had to take corrective action, as per the HOA bylaws regarding abandoned and non-compliant structures." "Corrective action?" I repeated, my voice devoid of emotion. I swept my gaze over the wreckage of my family's history. "You call this corrective action, Brenda? You were sent numerous warnings," she snapped, her confidence returning. "You chose to ignore them. Every board member signed the order. It's all perfectly legal. We have a right to maintain community standards." 2 county sheriff's cars, their lights off, rolled silently down the driveway and parked behind the demolition crew's truck. 2 deputies got out. Brenda didn't seem to notice them at first. Her entire focus was on me, the final showdown she had craved. "You have no idea what you've just done," I said, my voice low and carrying. "Oh, I think I do," she sneered. "I've improved the neighborhood. You've committed a felony," I stated plainly. "Destruction of private property, upwards of $250,000. You've done it without a court order, based on a fraudulent premise, and in direct violation of state law." She laughed, a shrill, ugly sound. "Don't threaten me with your amateur legal opinions again, Mr. Peterson. It's pathetic." The deputies were walking towards us now, their presence finally registering with her. Her eyes darted towards them, a flicker of annoyance on her face. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked, her voice oozing authority. "We're just cleaning up an abandoned property." One of the deputies, a tall man with a calm demeanor, looked at me, then at her. "Ma'am, we received a call about an illegal demolition." "It's not illegal," she insisted, puffing up her chest. "I am the president of the Homeowners Association. I have the order right here." She fumbled in her oversized purse, and produced a sheaf of papers, the HOA demolition order, signed by her and her puppet board. It was a worthless document, but she brandished it like a royal decree. The deputy took it and glanced at it with a practiced, unimpressed eye. He looked back at me. "Sir, is this your property?" "It is," I confirmed. I reached into my jacket, the one I had specifically worn for this occasion. I pulled out my wallet and flipped it open, not to the deputy, but directly to Brenda. I held it so she could see the golden shield, the eagle, the bold engraved letters, United States Environmental Protection Agency, Criminal Investigation Division. I watched her eyes read the words. I saw the moment the synapses fired in her brain, the moment the smugness was replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated panic. The color drained from her face, her jaw went slack. The sneer, the confidence, the very essence of her petty tyranny, simply froze, cracking like thin ice. "You," she whispered, the word barely audible. "I investigate people who break environmental laws for a living, Brenda," I said, my voice like stone. "People who build illegally on protected wetlands. People who forge documents. People who think rules don't apply to them. And as a sworn federal officer, I am also empowered to witness and report on a felony crime being committed in my presence. Officers," I said, turning to the deputies, "this woman, Brenda Vickers, has, without a court order, willfully and maliciously destroyed my private property. The evidence of her long-term pattern of fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering is in a file with my attorney. But this," I gestured to the ruins of my cabin, "this is what you can see with your own eyes. I wish to press charges to the fullest extent of the law." The world seemed to stop. The foreman of the demo crew was pale, realizing he'd been duped into participating in a major crime. Brenda just stood there, paralyzed, the worthless HOA order fluttering from her trembling hand. The badge had done its work. The illusion of her power was shattered, replaced by the cold, hard reality of consequence. The silence that followed the reveal of my badge was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was a silence filled with the implosion of an ego, the collapse of a petty empire. Brenda stood frozen, her face a mask of chalky disbelief. The two sheriff's deputies, who had initially responded to a routine property dispute call, were now looking at the situation with a new, professional gravity. The word federal has a way of changing the atmosphere. The senior deputy, whose nameplate read Miller, turned to Brenda. His calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a stern, official tone. "Ma'am, is what he's saying true? Did you order this demolition without a court-issued writ of execution?" Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound came out. Her brain, so adept at churning out bylaws and violations, had apparently short-circuited. "The board, we have standards," she finally stammered. "That's not what I asked, ma'am," Deputy Miller said, his patience clearly exhausted. He turned to his partner. "Cuff her." The click of the handcuffs snapping onto Brenda's wrists was a sound that sent a ripple of pure, unadulterated vindication through me. Her pantsuit, her armor of authority, now seemed absurdly out of place as she was read her Miranda rights against the backdrop of the wreckage she had created. The demolition foreman, seeing his employer being arrested, immediately started talking, eager to reframe himself as a victim. "Hey, she showed me an order, signed by a board. I thought it was legit. We're insured." Deputy Miller just gave him a tired look. "You'll need to come down to the station and give a full statement. Don't leave town." This was only the beginning. The arrest for felony destruction of property was the opening salvo. The real war would be fought with the mountain of evidence I had quietly compiled. The following Monday, my lawyer filed a massive civil lawsuit against the Whisperwood Lake HOA, naming Brenda Vickers, Gary Vickers, Dennis the treasurer, and Carol the secretary as individual defendants. We weren't just suing for the replacement value of the cabin. We were suing for punitive damages, emotional distress, legal fees. And we attached a RICO claim, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, citing the systematic pattern of mail fraud, the violation notices, wire fraud, the website payments, extortion, the fines, and embezzlement. We also filed an injunction demanding an immediate, court-ordered forensic audit of the HOA's finances for the entire duration of Brenda's presidency. The legal shockwave hit the small community like a tsunami. The other board members, Dennis and Carol, crumbled immediately. Faced with financial ruin and potential criminal charges, they turned on Brenda in a heartbeat. They gave sworn depositions, detailing how she controlled every decision, how she presented vendor contracts for her family members without disclosure, and how they were intimidated into signing off on everything, including the demolition order for my cabin. Carol, my unlikely informant, handed over the entire box of fraudulent expense receipts to my lawyer, which was then passed to the county prosecutor's office. This triggered a separate criminal investigation into Brenda for embezzlement. Her brother, the owner of Lush Green Landscapes, and her brother-in-law of Prestige Postboxes were also named in the civil suit, and soon found their own business practices under a microscope. It turned out they had been pulling similar scams with other small HOAs in the region. My little investigation was sprouting legs. The reaction from the other residents was a slow dawning wave of horror and then fury. George, my faithful ally, helped organize a special community meeting. This time, I didn't have to fight for the floor. They invited me to speak. I stood before them, not as a defendant, but as their liberator. I calmly laid out the facts, the self-dealing contracts, the appropriation of community land, the embezzlement of their dues. I explained how their money wasn't going to maintain their property values, but to fund Brenda's lifestyle and enrich her family. The looks of cowed submission I had seen at the last meeting were gone, replaced by righteous anger. Gary Vickers, Brenda's perpetually silent husband, sat in the front row, looking smaller and more bewildered than ever. He was legally on the hook for everything she had done. During the meeting, he stood up, his face pale, and publicly announced his resignation from the community, stating they would be putting their house up for sale immediately to cover the impending legal fees. It was a stunning public humiliation. Brenda was out on bail, but her reign was over. The court froze the HOA's assets pending the audit. The forensic accountant we hired uncovered years of systematic theft, totaling over $150,000. She had used their money for everything from luxury cruises, coded as property management training conferences, to her weekly high-end salon appointments, community outreach supplies. Faced with an avalanche of evidence and deserted by her former allies, Brenda took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to felony embezzlement and felony destruction of property. Her plea saved her from a long prison sentence, but she was sentenced to 5 years of probation, ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA for the embezzled funds, and most satisfyingly, ordered to pay me the full appraised replacement value of my cabin, plus damages, totaling nearly $350,000. The court also permanently barred her from ever serving on any board of any kind for the rest of her life. The civil suit was a slaughter. The HOA's insurance company settled almost immediately. Dennis and Carol, having cooperated, were dropped from the suit in exchange for their testimony, though they were forced to resign from the board in disgrace. A new board was elected, with George the plumber as its reluctant but sensible new president. Their first act was to conduct a bonfire, where they ceremoniously burned the old, labyrinthine book of bylaws Brenda had created. They reverted to the simple, original rules from decades ago. A new era of common sense had dawned on Whisperwood Lake. I used the settlement money to rebuild my cabin. I hired the best architect and the best craftsman I could find. We used my grandfather's original floor plans, but with modern, sustainable materials. And at the heart of the new cabin, we rebuilt the great stone fireplace, using the original stones that had survived Brenda's rampage, each one salvaged from the wreckage. It stands today, a testament not just to my grandfather's legacy, but to the idea that bullies and tyrants only have the power you grant them. Every time I light a fire in it, I think of Brenda. I hope she thinks of me, too, every time she has to report to her probation officer. The victory was sweet, but the real prize was seeing the community heal. The atmosphere at the lake is different now. People are friendly. They're planting the gardens they want, using the hose reels they want, and a wonderful chaotic assortment of mailboxes has blossomed at the end of the driveways. And at the end of my driveway, there's a new mailbox. It's a perfect replica of the one my grandfather built, right down to the hand-forged trout. It's not just a box for letters. It's a monument to the quiet, methodical, and deeply satisfying art of pro-revenge. Thanks for sticking through this crazy story. Remember to hit that subscribe button for more tales of justice served. Until next time.